Okay, guys, can everyone see the lookout screen now? And just so you're all aware, it's now being recorded, and at the end of this, I'll compress it down and we'll post it on the club's YouTube channel. So, rule five lookout. On its own, it's a pretty straightforward rule. Every vessel shall at all times maintain a proper lookout by sight and hearing, as well as all available means appropriate to prevailing circumstances and conditions, so as to make a full appraisal of the situation and risk of collision. So a couple of key phrases in there. The first one is all vessels. So everyone needs to maintain a proper lookout, and at all times, and using sight and hearing. We'll come on to sight and hearing and all other available means on one of the next slides. And then appropriate to the prevailing circumstances and conditions. That's one of those phrases which is constantly used in the rules, and it means pretty much what it says. So you should amend the amount of effort and resource you're applying to lookout, depending on what the conditions and the risks are. Does that make sense to everyone? And finally, what it does is it gives you the reason why we're keeping a good lookout. So we're not just keeping a good lookout because we want to spot some dolphins and chill while we're floating around in the Solent or the English Channel. We're keeping a good lookout so that we can make a full appraisal of the situation and of the risk of collision. Does that make sense? So a pretty straightforward rule, but by the time you're going for your yacht mastery exam, I'd expect you to have the idea that it means all vessels at all times, using all available means, including sight and hearing, and in order to make a full appraisal of the situation and assess risk of collision. Those are the 5 or 6 key points, all really important, bundled up into a couple of sentences. They're so important, this is one of those rules that I recommend you try and get pretty much off pat. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool, cool. Okay, so appropriate to prevailing circumstances and conditions. We're not going to talk about that too much during today's chat because I think it really is pretty self-explanatory. The more difficult it is to see what's going on around, perhaps the more people you should have on lookout, and perhaps the more additional aids you bring into your piece. But I'm going to talk about a couple of ideas which are pertinent to the kind of sailing we do and how we look out. And the first one is the top left image there. Can you see that fairly straightforwardly? There's a guy at the back of the cockpit, and then there's a lady sitting right at the front of the cockpit, stuck under the spray hood, yeah? Anyone want to talk to me a couple of points straight away from that image that we might want to consider about keeping a good lookout?
The underside of the sail, the starboard side on that shot might not be very well looked after in terms of collision.
Yeah, certainly you're right. I was going to talk about that on the top right image, the Puma one. Clearly, when you've got a big sail up and a big Genoa in particular, and to some extent a spinnaker, it's really, really quite difficult to keep a good lookout. So one of those crew members should be looking out down the starboard side of the boat there, to keeping a good lookout underneath the sail. Certainly, if you're in the Solent, somebody needs to be looking out underneath the sail pretty much all of the time. Otherwise, a close quarters situation can develop very, very quickly, and you've got very little time to react to it, if at all. Any other points that you might want to talk about the situation in that cockpit? Fernando?
Just get the spray hood limits visibility.
Yeah, they've made things more difficult for themselves, haven't they, with the spray hood up?
She's not doing anything at all.
She's not looking at all. She's looking in completely the wrong direction. She's nicely dressed for the weather, but not really helping. So she could be participating. I think that pretty much covers it. So when you're looking and thinking about the lookout rule, think about what the people on your boat are doing, and delegate tasks. And we're going to talk about particularly this idea of crew sitting in the cockpit doing nothing in a minute when I run through a couple of the examples of where it's gone wrong recently. If we look down at the top right, I think Anna's already picked it up. You can see the big sail there. You can see how much that restricts visibility, but think about how the conditions change based on how you're sailing and what you might need to do additionally in order to maintain your proper and effective lookout. Happy?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think I've put the slide of the two guys, so left middle? What do you reckon that line, what do you reckon I want to talk about in that slide?
They seem to be racing, right?
No. I just assume people aren't keeping a good lookout when they're racing, to be honest, Fernando.
Yeah. You need someone looking backwards, I suppose.
Behind.
Maybe that wasn't the point. It's probably quite subtle. Janet?
I guess he's ready to release the sheets so that they can take avoiding action, quick notice.
Maybe. I think he's just possibly. I think he's taken up the tension on that, or it's a very light. That wasn't what I was after, no.
Lightweight spinnaker.
I think it is a lightweight spinnaker you're at, but I don't think that wasn't what I was going to talk about. He's wearing sunglasses. Why is wearing sunglasses important?
You can be blinded, maybe.
Yeah, so it's sunglasses are pretty much a necessary bit of equipment on the boat. Pretty much any time of the year, the glare off the water hurts your eyes, and if you're not wearing sunglasses, I would say 80% of the time, even in the UK, during daylight hours, you can't be keeping a proper lookout. And it's important as well that you keep your crew comfortable and rested and rotating around and changing the jobs. If your crew can't keep a lookout, then they're not doing the job. The other thing that can affect what's another thing that can affect people's ability to look out? So maybe on a day similar to today, maybe a little worse weather than today, those of us who have to wear spectacles.
Spray
or
yeah.
drizzle on the it almost makes it impossible for you to be keeping a good lookout. So it's not just about having people up in the cockpit, it's making sure that the people up in the cockpit are fit and to some extent trained and understand what you want them to do as a lookout, yeah? And then we're going to talk about the other three screens. We've got a radar display, an AIS display, and a radio. So the rules say that you should use sight and sound. What are we thinking about sound? Why would they mention sound in particular?
On the boats that
Foghorns.
Foghorns, the radio.
Sound signals was what the rule was written for. But I think more pertinent now, the radio is a really, really useful way to avoiding collisions. So in the English Channel and most piloted waters, which is, to be honest, where the risk of collision increases significantly, you'll find that there are port control frequencies which allow big vessels and vessels manoeuvring in the area to report their movements or their intended movements. So it's a really useful skill to be able to listen out on those radio channels and be able to anticipate what's happening and understand what the implications for those are. So tie that in with your planning. You can see when you're planning in most entry, when you're planning your entry into a harbour or manoeuvring around the coast, you can see where vessels are required to report. It's a little, normally a circle with a triangle. The triangle indicates the direction of movement for which reporting is required. They're called radio reporting points, and you need to have an idea of where they are, and that helps you build your oral picture from the radio as well.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, from some Solent sailors, what are the key frequencies which we use in the Solent?
87.
What do we use 87 for?
Oh, blank head. 87. Somebody help me out. Oh, 87.
Marinas.
No, that's 80. That's 80.
I think I'm not sure that 87 is a particularly commonly used frequency. It might be a racing frequency or something.
I wonder if that's Southampton Port. It might be STS. I'm not sure.
It's not. VTS, Southampton Vessel Traffic Scheme, is on. Any ideas? Any vague memories?
Or is that 72?
No.
Can't remember.
1-4.
Nearly
in a line.
1-4. We're getting closer with 1-4.
Either 10 or 11.
11 in Portsmouth, right?
11 is QHM in Portsmouth, correct?
Mm-hmm.
For Southampton.
Southampton VTS is 12. 11 is Portsmouth. And what's the other frequency that you might want to be listening out to?
16, obviously.
16, obviously. Cool. And then we have other electronic navigation aids, which we can AIS, which is massively useful for spotting where big vessels are and to some extent smaller vessels. I use it quite a lot when, for example, if I'm coming down the Hamble and I want to see whether traffic's coming up and down the Solent or down Southampton Water. Well before I even get out to the South Cardinal, I can have an idea of what the traffic movements are on the Solent or the traffic density. So you can scan ahead in time and see what's going on. Peter, have you got a question there?
Yes, please. Could you just repeat that bit about the radio reporting points who uses those? Thanks.
Who uses radio reporting points? So it will be laid down in the in the almanac or the pilot, but vessels over a certain size, and it's not normally that large. So to go into Portsmouth, it's vessels over 20 metres have to report.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be told you'll be laid down that you have to request permission to manoeuvre or call VTS or QHM and tell them that you're there. And if you listen out on those channels when you're out sailing, you'll hear vessels doing exactly that. So pretty much from Nab all the way through the Solent to the Needle and up to Southampton Water, there are various points where vessels are calling in and out and qualifying with the VTS where exactly they are. That's the example in the Solent, but you have similar things all over the world.
So we would hear those on those channels you mentioned, 11 and 12.
11 and 12, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
But well, the point is you have to have done the research, because otherwise the chatter is meaningless.
Yeah.
Cool. And then finally, radar, it helps us distinguish what's around us, and is particularly useful when visibility is poor. Why would radar be better than AIS when visibility is poor? Anyone wants to have a stab at that?
Because it'll show you absolutely everything, vessels as well as hard things like the land.
It does, yeah. And because it shows you absolutely everything, it can take a bit of practice to use it. And also, because radars are getting better and better and using more and more technology, actually every radar display or every radar set different in terms of different types. So a Raymarine set is now quite different from a Garmin set in how you set it up and operate it. It's really important that you practice on the radar on the boat which you're on and learn how to tune it and set it up and use the various tracking aids which are internal to it. It's not something that you're going to be able to do very quickly as the visibility comes down if you haven't practiced it before. The time to practice that is when you're in good visibility as opposed to when you're in poor visibility. To some extent, you can practice quite a lot of it from alongside or particularly anchor. So if you can find an anchorage which is near a busy fairway, you can do quite a lot of practice on a radar set, and it's well worth doing if you've got your own boat or you're chartering. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about a couple of recent cases where, unfortunately, in one case, somebody was killed. In another case, there was some serious damage. And they were quite lucky that nobody was killed, which purely on the basis of nobody keeping a good look at. And we'll talk through what happened. And the lesson's fairly straightforward. Keep a good lookout. But I just think it brings home how easy it is, and just think about how easy it would have been for you to get yourselves into a situation like that, because both situations are fairly understandable. And I think with hindsight, we could all say, therefore, but the grace of God go us. Okay, the first one was about 5 years ago, and it happened just off Harwich, and it was a collision between a dredger Shoreway, and the small Moody, I think it was a 32-foot Moody Orca.
Is preparing to embark.
Can you guys see the slide okay, and see the track?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Orca went out for a day sail. They left, I forgot what that marina's called. Doesn't matter anyway. They left.
Wolverstone.
Wolverstone. Yeah, they left Wolverstone about 9:30 in the morning, and proceeded down the channel past Shotley, and out to sea for a little day sail. It was a man and his wife. The wife, to all intents and purposes, was a non-sailor, so she was a passenger on the craft. And just after the lunch, they turned around and started heading back up into towards Wolverstone Marina, and you can see their track there in red. Yeah. Just after lunch, the dredger Shoreway left, and what happened was at about 1 o'clock, the owner of Orca decided he was going to turn back, and he was monitoring the traffic as it came out through the approaches to Harwich and Felixstowe, and he saw Shoreway in what he thought was the deep water channel. Does that make sense? And he followed it through, and just before 1:30, he decided that he needed to go down for a pee. He didn't say anything to his wife, and his wife was tucked up in the front of the cockpit, very much in the same position as that lady in the picture on the previous slide. So she was sitting there with a magazine, just acting as a passenger. He went down to use the heads, and having assumed that the dredger was going to continue out.
No, niente, io non sto in cucina, delego.
Oh yeah, I'm just going to mute you all again.
Dario.
He continued, went down below, having seen that the dredger was in the Harwich Deepwater Channel, and assumed that was where he was going to go. The dredger was actually heading out to the south of the channel, and the master was sitting on his bridge, and you can see at the front of the dredger there's quite a lot of equipment. Yeah, the master sat in his chair and didn't manoeuvre at all. So two things happened at exactly the same time. The dredger left. I'm just going to put the pointer on. Can you see now that the dredger began to depart the channel, and the skipper had gone down below to use the heads at the same time, not observed each other. His wife wasn't looking out to see what happened. And while he was in the heads, the two vessels collided. The vessels collided with such force that the water flowing into the cockpit as it sank washed the wife off the seat in the front of the cockpit and down into the main saloon. What happened next is another interesting story. The guy's life jacket, it was an automatic inflating life jacket, didn't inflate. Unfortunately, his wife, who had been sitting on the upper deck, her automatic life jacket did inflate. So he was able to swim free, and she unfortunately drowned during the incident. The officer watch of the dredger was prosecuted and sentenced to a number of months. I think it was 8 months suspended. Actually, he didn't actually go to prison but both ships are at fault here for not keeping a good lookout. Does that make sense? And very easy thing to happen if you think about it. Really, how many times have you been sitting in the cockpit, piddling along, and somebody's been sitting at the front, not really looking out? So it was just that they were motoring, nothing complicated happening, good visibility. easy peasy day and ends in tragedy just because he didn't say, while I'm down, just keep a lookout. So the last thing I always do before I leave the cockpit, and those who sail with me will see me do it, is I leave the cockpit, my head's up, looking around, having a quick look, and then I'll say, I've seen this, I've seen this, I've seen this, and then ask for people to update me if there's anything changes. Does that make sense? Happy days. Okay, the next is a more recent incident, and I don't know if you can recognise the piece of waterway I'm showing you here, but this is a precautionary area out in the middle of the Solent. Cowshot Spit is just up here, so we've got a red track. That's the track of a vessel, the Red Falcon, and the yellow track is a vessel, the track of a smaller vessel, the Phoenix, which is about a 30-foot motorboat. The Red Falcon was transiting down through the precautionary area and turned left just before Bourne Gap to head down towards towards Cowes. What you'll notice throughout the period that he was transiting down here, can you see that the yellow dots for the same time and the red dots, that the vessel was on a steady bearing, so that there was no bearing change between the vessels. So you can also see the pictures from the MIB report, and it showed it's not simulates. They went out and took the photograph in similar conditions. The accident happened. You could see that the sun was thoroughly blinding for the officer watcher who was looking out to the down and to the right, which is where he would have seen Phoenix had he been able to. Does that make sense? They also show in the report that the smaller vessel was almost certainly in the because the radar was so high up on the vessel, the first returns were beyond where the vessel was. The distances on that are less than 200 yards at this point. Very, very close in, radars from big vessels can't see smaller vessels. That makes sense because it basically looks over the top of you. So the officer watcher was being blinded by the sun, couldn't see him on the radar. And then this guy wasn't, does anyone want to hazard a guess what the guy in yellow, what was he doing wrong in the first place? So I'll unmute you all.
Not looking out?
He wasn't looking out, but also what was he doing wrong here?
He's got into a precautionary area.
He's gone into the precautionary area, and how's he crossing it?
At the wrong angle.
At the wrong angle.
Yeah, he's crossing it at a very shallow angle, isn't he? So he's not keeping a look. So subsequently, it turns out he wasn't keeping a lookout, but he wasn't crossing at right angles. And one of the reasons that we cross at right angles is so that vessels can see you as you come down and see and expect to see what you're doing. If you're travelling on a course which is very close to the channel, the vessel's not going to expect you to suddenly swerve out over the side of it. Imagine if you were, as you drive down the road, we don't expect pedestrians who are walking down the pavement suddenly to veer out across the road to us, do we? It's very much the same situation when big ships are navigating in narrow channels, which he clearly was at this stage. Does that make sense? Mm. The reverse of the situation was kind of true in the previous incident as well. So we don't expect big ships to veer out of the channel either, which was part of the contributing factor which allowed the collision between Orca and the dredger.
Mm.
So we've got the officer watch who's being blinded. He hasn't got a particularly good radar display, and the yellow vessel is doing something a bit unusual, and it turns out he wasn't looking out. So as he crosses into the channel, his aspect is the Red Falcon is actually over his port quarter. And the outcome is that they have this glancing collision. The Red Falcon didn't actually notice the collision. It was only reported later, and that was recorded. And they discovered that as part of the evidence when they went back through the boat's video camera log. But you can see two instances which in areas where we operate all the time, and just because we're maybe a little bit too relaxed and not thinking about keeping lookout, how close you can come to near tragedy, or how you can actually have a tragedy by not following this really, really basic rule. Happy days, guys?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so how's it going to move? So I've gone on a bit longer than I anticipated to. I hope that was reasonably useful. And the links here for the MIB reports are there as well if you want to have a read of them. Both really, really interesting reports. Any questions or additional comments or ideas of anything which we could do as we move through this to improve?
Mike, at what distance, or a normal 30 to 40 foot yacht, how far away will radar pick them up? What kind of distance? How sensitive is the good radars these days?
Well, it depends.
The
thing that you're going to do, you need to have on a 30 or 40 foot yacht is you need to have a radar reflector.
Yeah.
A boat will pick up a radar reflector at about maybe 1.5 to 2 miles. That's graded if the sea conditions decrease. So you have to tune your radar so that you can see small contacts. But the more you tune out sea clutter, the more you detune the radar so that you can't see small contacts. Does that make sense? There's a balance you've always got to have.
Yeah, understood. Yeah.
But modern radars are really, really good. So I'd be surprised, apart from in the very worst conditions, if you've got a radar reflector, that a boat a merchantman wouldn't see at about 1 to 2 miles.
Good. Thanks.
Would the Red Falcon not be using AIS as well?
Yeah, but the motor cruiser, I don't know whether the motor cruiser had AIS on or not, but he's not required to by law because of his size. And the other thing that happens is AIS can be, not all boats broadcast AIS at the same rate. So if you're on a recreational style at AIS, you might only be updating every 30 seconds to a minute. And AIS does have a disadvantage in that people over-rely on it, so they expect to see stuff on AIS and they become lazy and they don't look for the underlying detail. And that guy on the Red Falcon, he's probably really busy. He's probably the guy who's pressing the recordings to tell people to stay away from their cars, and he's looking at 101 other things. And you know what it's like out when it's busy in the solar. He's probably looking ahead to a race which is taking part by the entrance of cows and working out what he's going to do there. So he hasn't got all the time in the world to turn overlays on and off and zoom in and out on his radar screen. So the Mark 1 eyeball in close proximity is always the best solution, I think. Peter Lewis, have you got a question there?
Yes, please, Mike. In the first example, is there something else the dredger should have done to say she was leaving the shipping lane?
I don't know. I didn't reread the report in detail again this morning, but from memory, it wasn't a criticism.
Okay.
What the basic thing the dredger should have been doing, the Officer Watch was predominantly criticised for not getting out off his arse and walking around the bridge. So there's some pictures in the report which show the bridge layout and the arcs of visibility from various points of the bridge. And what they establish is if you just sit in the chair, you can't see it. The same is true when you're in a yacht as well. If you just stand there by the wheel, you can't see. You need to move to the left and the right and have a look under and keep moving around. Yachting's a sport, so you should move around a bit. Any other questions, guys? Stephen, I'm liking your background.
What's that?
I'm liking your background, mate.
Oh, yeah. Have I got Boris right behind me?
You have, yeah. He's looking better than when I last saw him.
Yeah. He's been a bit croaky recently.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, very good, Mike. Thank you.
Speak to you at 3, Mike. Thank you very much.
Catch you later. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
guys.
Mike. Very good.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mike. Terrific.
Thank you.